Hosea. Everybody ever heard of Hosea? One of those prophets in the Old Testament. Lived about 750 years before Jesus was born. And like all prophets, not only are they God's mouthpiece, so they speak for God, right? God gives them words, they speak to the people. But they usually have kind of challenging assignments, and Hosea was no different. His challenge and assignment was quite interesting. God asked Hosea to get married. And we know that can be a challenging assignment, right? Under the best of conditions, that can be a challenging assignment. But God didn't ask Hosea to marry his childhood sweetheart. He didn't ask Hosea to marry someone that his parents had kind of known for years, and they kind of prearranged this marriage. God asked Hosea to marry this woman named Gomer. This woman named Gomer. Now, I grew up in the Gomer Pyle era, right? Golly, so every time I, just read that, the image of Gomer Pyle, right? But there was a woman named Gomer, and the name wasn't the worst of it. She was a very promiscuous woman before she got married. In fact, some scholars believe she was actually a prostitute. And the irony is that God knew this about her, and he knew that she would still be unfaithful even after the marriage. And yet the question is, so why? Why would God want Hosea, his prophet, his mouthpiece, the guy representing God in front of the people, why would God want his man to marry a prostitute? Doesn't God want us to marry someone that we love, someone that we can honor and keep, and who will do the same for us, that we can commit ourselves fully to them, and we know that they're going to be committed fully to us? Absolutely. This is what God wants for us, and yet there's always an exception, and oftentimes the prophets were called to live out that exception, because what God wanted to show through Hosea in his marriage to Gomer was a living sign, a symbol to the rest of his people. You see, God knew that Gomer would be, again, unfaithful even on the other side of the marriage, and God would then call Hosea to go and redeem her, to buy her back. There was a purchase price that had to be paid in those days for marriage. And so after he had already done that once and taken her as his wife, she would run and be in the arms of another man. He would go again and buy her back and take her as his own. This was be a sign to the rest of Israel of what God himself wanted to do to his people. The very people that God had saved, the people that were absolutely no people, just a bunch of slaves in Egypt. When God rescued them from slavery, brought them into this land, and getting ready to preparing them to go into the land flowing with milk and honey that had promised to their ancestor Abraham. God made covenant with them after the Exodus. He promised to be their God. They, in return, promised to be faithful to God. And yet, they repeatedly, when we read the prophets, when we get to this in a few weeks, when we read the prophets, you're just going to see the same story over and over and over and over again. You're like, you're just kind of a bunch of knuckleheads, and we forget that we can be those same people, right? We know the right thing to do, and we're unfaithful. We continue to break covenant. And time and again, as they played the role of Gomer, running to the arms of other men, worshiping other gods and worthless idols, each time, just like God would call Hosea, every time God's people would be unfaithful, God would come back to them, redeem them, and take them as his own. Now, when it comes to Hosea, not many of us would be willing to sign up for that kind of marriage, right? I mean, that's not what we want. We go into marriage with the best of intentions, right? We see best intentions being played out in weddings. We love weddings. I used to think people loved weddings because of the great words that I spoke at a wedding. The teaching about biblical marriage, how personal. Oh, it's so personal. You just captured the essence of who they were. It was, love is patient and kind. Would read a scripture, would pray, and I'd give these words, and then I'd ask the bride and groom to turn and face one another. And I noticed over time, what happened is, at that moment when I asked bride and groom to turn and face one another, everybody in the audience does something. They wake up. Which was, but that's what we do, right? Because now The preliminaries are over. Now we're getting to the good stuff. The real wedding, right? The vows. And that's what people come for. And they wonder, he's always so stoic. I wonder if he'll show any kind of emotion. Or she's the drama queen. What's going to happen when she tries to get her vows out, right? And the one thing that we never really see in the vows are, we never see husband and wife turning to one another and saying, I promise to love, honor, and keep you so long as you make $50,000 a year and do your fair share of the chores at home. We never say that. I will honor and keep you as long as you're taking care of all my needs. I will be faithful to you as long as you don't let yourself go and you keep going to the gym every day. Ouch. That actually sounds a little more like a contract, right? Like a cell phone agreement. We're actually signing this contract, actually believing the worst about one another, believing that there's a really good chance that one of us, or probably both of us, aren't going to uphold our end of the deal. And sadly, as we all know, some of us personally, that's what marriage can all too easily deteriorate into. But that's not how we go into marriage. Those aren't our intentions, right? At a wedding, instead of turning to one another and negotiating terms of a contract, we use the language of covenant to honor and keep, to love one another for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and health, to honor, love, and cherish until death do we part. This is my solemn vow. It's the language of covenant and commitment. And guess what? Covenant and commitment is the language that God speaks to his people when he wants to communicate his love and his loyalty to them. And that's what we're going to take a look at today, God's covenant. Several covenants, in particular the main covenant in the Old Testament that we will know as the Ten Commandments. You've probably heard of that. We're going to teach you something new about the Ten Commandments, something that you may have never even known about the Ten Commandments that's going to make all the difference in how we actually read and receive what God is saying through these Ten Commandments. Now, if you're new, let me catch you up. You've heard, hey, long story short. So this is the longest series we've ever done at Morning Star, 13 weeks, where we're looking at the major themes of the Bible. So we're not going to be able to cover everything, but Genesis to Exodus, where we are today, and then on to Revelation. The major themes of the Bible, we're doing reading throughout the week to kind of connect the dots of what we can't cover. Those readings are available online. Just go to our website at the very top, click the red banner, and you'll go down there. You can sign up for one of those turbo groups that meets tomorrow night and Wednesday night. Those are just 6 weeks, so it's not a forever commitment. 6 weeks right here at the church, and love to have you join us in an hour and a half. We're going to be unpacking and applying today's message to our lives. So I'm leading tomorrow night, Pastor Keith on Wednesday night. If you all sign up for Wednesday night, I'll know what you think about me. All right? So let me catch you up if you're new here. So we began where the Bible begins with creation, the idea that God is a God who loves and creates, and the creation is a reflection of his love and commitment, and the idea that God didn't just create and walk away, that God is bigger than big, he's gooder than good, closer than close, and he's still creating. The universe is still expanding at astronomical rates, right? So we saw in week 2 the promise that God made to Abraham. We learned that God is not just a promise maker, that God is also a promise keeper, that he still makes and keeps his promises. Last week, we looked at the Exodus, God sending Moses back to Egypt to get in Pharaoh's face and say, let my people go. Finally, after a series of 10 plagues, Pharaoh relents, kicks the Israelites out. Then he kind of has what did I just do? This is my labor force, 6 million people. They're the ones building my pyramids. He changes his mind. The Israelites have already left. They find themselves at the Red Sea, and here comes Pharaoh's army. They're stuck between that rock and a hard place, and then God does the miracle, the waymaker. He makes a way through the middle of the sea. They pass through on dry ground. Remember this? And then when the Egyptians pursue, we've seen the movie, the waters come and swallow them up. And here they are now. Here they are out of Egypt. They've been delivered. And God is getting ready to bring them to a place called Sinai, Mount Sinai. You've heard of this. And at Mount Sinai, God has brought his people there for one purpose, to make a covenant with them. The same idea that God made a covenant with Noah, that God made a covenant with Abraham, God now, hundreds of years after Abraham, this group of slaves who've been slaves generationally, 400 years have been slaves. God is going to make covenant with them to be his people and for him to be their God. And just so you know, here's what a covenant is. First and foremost, it's a relationship. It's not a contract. It's a relationship between parties in which each party voluntarily agrees, nobody's coerced, nobody's forced, to certain conditions, and then promises, hey, we're going to agree to voluntarily to these conditions, and promises to uphold their end of the deal, their end of the commitment. And we see this, we see covenant being lived out and expressed in Exodus 19. And here's why this is so important. Please catch this if you tune out for the rest of the sermon. Because so oftentimes, Exodus 19 is what we miss. We know that the Ten Commandments are coming up in Exodus 20, so we're really quick to get to the big, show on Mount Sinai and the Ten Commandments, and we just tend to buzz right past Exodus 19. And if we do that, we miss something incredibly important. We miss God's vows to his people. Because the Ten Commandments, we see the vows we as the people are making with God. And that's what we usually focus on, but we just miss the fact that before God asked his people to make the conditions, here are the conditions, I need you to say yes to that. Before he gives the conditions, God makes a promise to his people. Let's take a look. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him to the mountain, or from the mountain, and said, this is what you are to say to the people of Israel. Hey, you yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you out to myself. Remember last week we talked about the Exodus being the seminal moment of the Old Testament, the salvation story, and God would continue to point the people back. Even Passover today is a way of going back and retelling the story of when God would deliver his people. So he begins with this, and then he says, now, if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Before God asks us to do anything, God says, hey, you are so special to me. And there are two things I want us to understand about every covenant, especially this covenant. The first is that God always initiates covenant. This is God. This is not human beings saying, hey, God, here's a deal for you. What do you think? Covenant is always God saying, hey, here's what I want to do for you. It's always God reaching down to us. After the flood, God came to Noah and said, I promise that I will never again send a flood to destroy the earth. To Abraham didn't be like, I'm old and I've lived here forever. I'd like a change of scenery. God, let's move somewhere. No, God came to Abraham, remember, said, leave the place you're going, go to the place that I will show you, and I will bless you. I will make your name mighty. I will give you more descendants, more numerous than the stars of the sky and the grains of sand on the earth. I will bless you that all the nations of the earth will be blessed through you, and you will be a mighty nation. Interestingly, Abraham was 75 years old when God made that promise. Remember, it was 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90 when they actually had the child of the promise. So the interesting thing is, hey, this is not human beings trying to barter an agreement with God. This is God coming to us and saying, I want more than anything to be in relationship with you. So God initiates covenant, and covenant is always God's intention to bless. God who wants the best of us. Before he says, here's what you need to do for me, he says, hey, you will be my treasured possession. Out of all the peoples of the earth, everything belongs to me. I created everything. You will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is so important, friends, because in the absence of not reading Exodus 19, God's commitment to us, we can focus only on the Ten Commandments, which is what so many of us have always done. Well, this is what God wants us to do, and God expects us, and we got to do all this, and what's God going to do? Well, he's already told us. Treasured possession, kingdom of priests, holy nation. And so in light of this, in light of God's promise, we now see the Ten Commandments not as control, but actually as a gift of God's grace and compassion and love. God wasn't freeing the Israelites from Pharaoh only to enslave them to himself and the law. This was an expression of grace. That's how the Israelites saw it, because they had heard the promise and agreed to do what God had called them to do, because this God had just delivered them from slavery, and he was now saying, hey, by the way, I've not just delivered you from slavery, I'm going to deliver you to the land that I promised to your ancestor Abraham. I'm going to deliver you to this land flowing with milk and honey. It wasn't control. It was God communicating his love, his desire to bless his people with the best. So with that in mind, God initiates, God blesses. Let's take a look at what happens next. So Moses went back, summoned the elders of the people, set before them all the words the Lord had commanded him to speak. The people responded together, we will do everything the Lord has said. Let's say that together. We will do everything the Lord has said. Do you mean that? Of course you don't. I mean, you do. You'd like to, right? But you also know, I'm probably not going to get out of, service today before I've broken, some sort of commandment somewhere. Certainly not out of the parking lot, because I've seen how people here drive, right? But you got to ask, why wouldn't these group of people say, whatever you say, God, we will do? God has just brought them from slavery, and by the way, they were slaves. They had nothing. They had absolutely nothing to lose and pretty much everything to gain, right? Huge upside. So let's take a look at the actual covenant. You've seen this part. Probably haven't seen Exodus 19, but you've seen Exodus 20, that begins again with God saying, oh, remember, never forget, never forget, never forget. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And then the Big Ten, called the Decalogue. That's a fancy word. Decalogue, meaning 10 commandments. No other gods, no idols. Don't misuse God's name. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother so that it will go well with you. This is the first and the only command with an additional promise. Honor your father and mother so that it will go well with you. I instilled this in my children growing up. Honor us so that it will go well with you. Do I need to explain the other side? Do not kill, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. And when you look at those, what I want to ask you is there anything there that seems so heavy or controlling or cumbersome or punitive? I mean, that's the way sometimes we begin to think about the 10 Commandments, just a bunch of do's and don'ts of God. But this is just basic stuff. I mean, these rules have pretty much become the foundation that nation after nation after nation has adopted. This is the foundation stuff to govern nations. These are the guiding principles that every family wants to teach and instill in their children, right? To keep them away from harm. Don't covet, don't steal, don't kill, don't commit adultery. And if you don't do those things, not only will it keep you from harm, it'll put you in a place where you will be blessed. Now, I will say that if you keep reading after Exodus 20:17, for the next few books of the Bible, which we are probably not going to read a lot of this week, because it is just detail, painstaking precision that God goes through and continues to expand these 10 commandments into every area of your life. In fact, God has 603 additional commandments. I don't know why he didn't stop at 600. He probably had 600 in mind, then forgot a few more and added 3. But 613 commandments in all. And as you're reading that, it's like, oh, good. This is just so, this doesn't even apply to my life these days. And we got to remember the context. They were slaves. They didn't have rules. The only rules they knew were what they were told by the Egyptians. This was God having to detail every area of the life, to provide a framework and said, in this area, in this area, in this area, do this, don't do that, do this. The Israelites didn't know these kind of things. And again, to understand that God was initiating to bless, do these things, and you're going to prosper. You're going to be blessed. I'm going to bless you in amazing ways. This is what happens next. Moses took the book of the covenant, read it to the people, and they responded. Let's respond. We will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. Did they mean it? Did they want to? Do we want to? There was 2 things left to do. The first was to ratify the covenant. There was God's instruction to kill some oxen, take the blood of the oxen and sprinkle it over the people, sprinkle it over the book of the law, because in those days, in every covenant, blood was required to ratify the covenant. Blood was the symbol of life. It was saying, hey, this is what's going to give life, and if I don't keep my end of the agreement, I should die rather than continue to live. That's how important this covenant is to me. So there was the sacrifice of blood, and then there was the sign of the covenant. Every covenant has a sign, an outward sign. Just like in a wedding, after we commit and give our vows as husbands and wives, there's the exchange of rings, the outward commitment to say that, hey, I've committed myself to another. With Noah, the flood, remember the sign of the covenant was a rainbow. Abraham, the sign of the covenant was circumcision. I like rainbows. I like that first thing you did there, God. Hey, with the law at Sinai, there was a sign that God gave, and interestingly, the sign was one of the 10 commandments. It was actually the 4th commandment. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. When the Lord finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the 2 tablets of covenant law, the tablets of stone inscribed by the finger of God. This was the last words that God spoke. He said, after I've given you all these 613, this is the sign. The sign is the Sabbath. And I could preach on the Sabbath for weeks. This sign of the covenant, it was a blessing. And understand, God's intention was to bless. And out of all those 10 commandments, the easiest one to keep should be take a day off. You know what you have to do? Nothing. That's the point, right? Cease all your labor. And imagine how that sounded to a group of slaves. Do you know how many days off a year slaves get? None. So here was God saying to this people, the sign of the covenant is just to take a day off, not just once a year, but one in every 7 days, 52 days a year. That's almost a month and a half out of every year. Why? So that you will put your trust in me. Because all the other nations and all you've ever known, listen, in those days it wasn't just slaves, but every person in every other nation all around the Israelites worked every single day. That's just what they knew. I can't stop working. I'll get behind. What's going to happen? Other people are going to get ahead of me. And God says, no. This is why it needs to be the outward sign to show to other nations, to show to yourself, to remind yourself that when I take a day off, God doesn't. And God can actually do more in me and through me and for my family with me taking a day off and honoring the Sabbath and resting my body and putting my trust in Him than I could ever accomplish working 7 days a week. And by the way, that promise still holds. It is an everlasting covenant. We put our trust in God and we put faith in God by trusting Him with the first portion of our income. We do it with our time. The first day of the week, we give that to God. It was a sign to the Israelites. And here's why this was so important. And what would happen over time is that the Israelites, as we'll see, would be not necessarily so faithful. The first is they would turn the law, which God had given as an expression of His grace to guide them and bless them, they would turn that through human, manipulation into a system of works. And we see this in full-blown chaos at the time of Jesus with the Pharisees, who were so jot and tittle about everything. And what, the obedience to the law had become was not an expression of grace so that God could bless me. It had become a system to where I'm going to do this, and so God, you need to do this. And so it was a tit for a tat, and it was like, if I do this, God, you need to reward me. And if that didn't happen, then well, what? And it became a system. Instead of guiding people, it actually separated, created distance between people who were unable to fully keep the law. So it created, guilt and separation between God and people. And it also created a separation between people because you had the Pharisees, standing in front of the altar saying, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, like this, tax collector. And you've got this tax collector over here who knows he's a sinner, beating his chest saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It created distance between God and people. It created distance between people and people because of judgment. And the irony is, God knew it. And there was a reason. Here's what God said the second is the thing that happened is I've already alluded to this, God's people were just unfaithful. God gave it, and you just read the rest of the Old Testament, it's just time and time and time and time and time and time again. They know the right thing to do, they don't. They worship other gods, they go to other idols. God predicted this to Moses, saying, your children who will follow you in later generations and foreigners who will come to the distant lands will see the calamities that have fallen on the land. All the nations will ask, why is the Lord? The Lord has done so great things to his people and brought them. Why has he done this to the land? Why this fierce burning anger? And the answer will be, it is because this people abandoned the covenant of the Lord. They went off and worshiped other gods and bowed down to them. Generations of unfaithfulness where God's people played the role of Gomer and God playing the role of Hosea, redeeming and redeeming. Finally, God would send another prophet by the name of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah would point not back to the Exodus, to when God saved his people through parting the sea. Jeremiah pointed to the future. He pointed to something new that God would do. A new covenant where God himself would come and fulfill all the conditions of the covenant himself. Totally on God to do everything so that he could express his unconditional love, not just to a chosen people, but to all people. Do these words sound familiar? The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband, a faithful husband to them. This is the covenant that I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be their people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. For I will, say it with me, for I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. That is the new covenant that God sent his son, Jesus the Christ, to fulfill, to give his one and only life, the perfect life, the life that was able to do what no other life to that point or beyond could ever do, to fulfill the law, to live in complete obedience. The one who could say, I will do everything the Lord has said and keep his word. Jesus said this in the Sermon on the Mount, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them. I have come to fulfill them. And when Jesus gave his life on the cross, the shedding of his blood ratified the new covenant to pronounce that everything had been done. It was a once and for all sacrifice, not of an animal, but of a perfect life. And that life becomes a substitute, a substitutionary atonement for our sin. By Christ's death on the cross, God looks at that, and when he looks at us, he does not see our sin for those of us who have put our hope and trust in him, who've confessed our sin. God does not see our sin. He sees the righteousness of Jesus Christ. It is by his blood that we have been saved. And like every covenant, God gives signs of this new covenant. And there are two. The sacrament of holy baptism that reminds us that we are welcomed, all of us. Not just because of who your ancestor, and can you trace your lineage back to Abraham, but all God's people, Jews and Gentiles, have been included in this covenant because it is about what God has done for us, not about our obedience to the law. God has made this new family of Jesus for us that we get initiated into the sacrament of baptism and then the sacrament of Holy Communion that we're about to participate in right now. That reminds us in these elements that Christ gave his life on the cross for us, and that putting our trust and confidence in him, we can have our sins forgiven and experience life abundant and eternal.